Hey everyone, welcome back to Christ is the Cure. We are continuing the Back to Basics series. Last time we talked about the triune nature of God, and this week we will go into the attributes of God. Makes sense, right? Before we do that, I just want to say, go check out christisthecure.org. It's been repolished. Typography is easier on the eye. Some of the pages have been redone. A lot more minimal, hopefully more accessible. The resource page is going to be a work in progress for a little bit as I kind of think about how I want to rebuild and make that easier to access. But go check it out, and hopefully you enjoy how it looks. Also, before we begin, remember that Christ is the Cure is subscriber supported, so consider joining the support team at patreon.com/Christ is the Cure. Patrons keep us running, keep us going, and all that good stuff. But let's move into the topic for today, the attributes of God. So when we were describing God's triune nature, there were a couple times where strings of attributes were kind of just mentioned in passing, and now we're going to flesh that out in a little bit more detail. And it's tempting to just kind of jump into a list of attributes and define them, but we should probably speak briefly about the knowledge of God and his being first, right? So it's worth stating that immediately that God is incomprehensible. He is, in his inmost being, the incomprehensible one. This is not saying, however, that God cannot be understood or known entirely, but rather that God is incomprehensible in that we will not fully or exhaustively understand God. Our knowledge of God is not only fully dependent upon God's divine revelation, but it is, quote, only a finite image, a faint likeness, and creaturely impression of the perfect knowledge that God has of himself. And that's from Herman Babnick's Reformed Dogmatics, which will be quoted a good deal here, along with Louis Berkhof's Systematic Theology as we go through the attributes of God. But despite this, that is the incomprehensible nature of God, because of divine revelation, we have true and trustworthy knowledge of God to the degree that it has been revealed. With that said, even in the attributes we share with God, our understanding of those attributes in God is limited. We cannot grasp the depth of God's love or power, even though we understand love and power to a degree within our world as creatures. We understand such things, but it's still limited when we discuss the being of God. The psalmists speak frequently of the unsearchable greatness of God, the depth of him and his wisdom and his knowledge. And Paul echoes this sentiment when he points out that no one knows the things of God except God's Spirit in 1 Corinthians 2:10-12. Berkhof will summarize, quote, the being of God is characterized by a depth, a fullness, a variety, and a glory far beyond our comprehension, and the Bible represents it as a glorious, harmonious whole without any inherent contradiction, and this fullness of life finds expression in no other way than in the perfections of God, end quote, and that's from his Systematic Theology. So with this incomprehensible aspect mentioned, first it's worth noting that an attribute is not part of God or something we use merely as an adjective concerning God. Instead, attributes are what God is. Speaking of God's attributes is to speak concerning God's nature and what all three persons of the Godhead share in common. They are characteristics or qualities that are essential to God. Now, historically, theologians have categorized God's attributes in many ways, yet one of the most common and helpful, in my opinion, are the categories of incommunicable and communicable attributes. Incommunicable attributes are attributes that God does not share or communicate with others, such as the reality that God is unchangeable while we are changeable, or that God is omnipresent or present everywhere while we are not. So again, incommunicable attributes are those attributes that God does not share with others. And so logically, on the flip side of that are the communicable attributes of God that he does share or communicate to us, such as love, justice, spirituality, and so forth. Now, really, every categorization has its own limitations, including this one, and it becomes pretty logical to see why whenever you think about the communicable attributes, such as we lack God's knowledge, wisdom, depth, and love, and so forth, but we do have those attributes as communicable attributes. And so while we share these attributes, they're not fully shared as we are finite creatures and God is God and we are not. This actually ties in to God's holiness. He is higher and separate from us as God. And you see this, of course, in texts like Isaiah 55:9. Nonetheless, I think the categorization of communicable and incommunicable is the most helpful. Now, within Scripture, we are given scores of descriptions and names for God that reveal to us his character. The most prominent name that we've already encountered is Yahweh. The name of God given to his people, as Babnick will state, God's real name that expresses God's eternality and self-existence. Descriptions are plentiful in Scripture. In fact, Babnick documents many from creation, ranging from animals to objects to natural elements to human experiences, such as lions, the sun, a rock, foundation, shadow, temple, hearing, tasting, and so on. And then you have the metaphors and you have the anthropomorphic language, having human characteristics. And so what you see is that in Scripture, there is a lot of different descriptors used, means of describing God, and there's a variety of names, and all these things can be studied and should be studied. They're great things to look into and really dive into, but we're not really going to focus on that here. From here, we're just going to survey some of God's attributes while acknowledging that there are many excellent works that explore the topic in much more depth, both in the number of attributes highlighted and the examination of said attributes. And to give you some of that, you can see A.W. Pink's The Attributes of God. It's a classic. J.I. Packer's Knowing God is also a classic. Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God is also a classic. Tozer, Knowledge of the Holy, and basically any systematic theology such as Erickson's Christian Theology or his more introductory work that is Introducing Christian Doctrine. Louis Berkhoff, whom I'm quoting quite a bit here, Stephen Wellham's Systematic Theology, and so on. Basically, you can find some great in-depth resources on this topic if you want to go beyond what we're describing here. Because again, it will be a survey of only some of God's attributes, and we're not really going into the anthropomorphisms and the different names expressed in Scripture and so on and so forth. So this moves us into our first attribute of God, which is the simplicity of God. I briefly mentioned it last time, but it means that God and his attributes are one. God's attributes cannot be understood as pieces to a puzzle where the puzzle is God. God is not composite. He is not made up of parts. He is identical with his attributes. Quote, all God's attributes are identical with his essence, and all his attributes, he is pure being, absolute reality. And that, I believe, is from Herman Babnick's Reformed Dogmatics. In this quote, on the whole, it may be said that Scripture does not exalt one attribute of God at the expense of others, but represents them as existing in perfect harmony in the divine being. It may be true that now one and then another attribute is stressed, but Scripture clearly intends to give due emphasis to every one of them, and that one is from Louis Berkhoff. With this, we must be careful to understand that we cannot elevate one attribute or disregard another, as tempting as it can be in our culture. We have kind of seen this kind of back and forth between God's love and God's holiness, where they're kind of pitted against one another, but we can't do that. We have to see God as whole. Additionally, we must note that no addition was made to the nature of God. He is eternally perfect in all that he has. God not only has light, life, wisdom, and love, and so forth, but God is life, light, wisdom, and love. This does not negate logical distinctions in attributes. However, and ultimately, the attributes of God are all essential qualities of God. And, quote, these qualities cannot be altered without altering the essential being of God. The takeaway is, quote, God is not the product of composition. God is not composed of pre-existing things, nor the product of the combination of these entities. He is self-existent. His divine being is not the result of the combination of any pre-existing factors. Were this so, then those pre-existing factors would be more ultimate than God. This idea is unthinkable. Everything in God is God. Nothing that is God can be subtracted from God, and God still be God. And that's from Rob Ventura in a new exposition of the London Baptist Confession of Faith of 1689, which is a great book. So this leads to what has been mentioned a few times now, God's self-existence. Usually the term to describe God's self-existence are aseity or independence. The meaning of this is that God does not require, need, or have any cause for his existence. The grounds of his existence are himself. Not only is he unlike us in that we are dependent upon another and others for life, but God is independent in everything. God does not need us or any part of creation for any reason or his existence. You can see Acts 17:24-25. God has life in himself. See John 5:26. And he is independent of all things. See Psalm 94:8. God is entirely independent and works according to his own counsel and will. And you can see Psalm 33:11, Daniel 4:35, Ephesians 1:5, Revelation 4:11. And he does not require anything external to himself for his existence or works. God is Yahweh, or as spoken to Moses, I am who I am in Exodus 3:14. He is the one who is, who was, and is to come, the Alpha and the Omega, Revelation 1:8. Logically related to this is the fact that God is immutable. This means that God does not change. He remains who he is. You see this in Psalm 102:26-28. As I just quoted a second ago, God is the one who is, was, and is to come, the first and the last, expressed numerous times within the text of Scripture in Isaiah 41:4, 44:6, 48:12, and Revelation 1:17. God's nature does not change, his perfections do not change, and he is free from any growth, decay, addition, or subtraction. You see this in Malachi 3:6, Hebrews 1:11-12, James 1:17. Yet, quote, God's immutability should never be confused with a monotonous sameness or rigid immobility. The unchanging God is a living God who is related to his creatures in manifold ways and participates in their lives. And that's from Herman Bavinck. And so what we see is that God is mobile and that God is always in action, entering into various relationships with man. And thus there is a type of change in the relations of men with God, but not a change in God's essence. This correlates with those discussions on the various texts where God appears to change his mind. Such texts need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, which really goes beyond our scope here. But we must also learn to recognize when human expressions are applied to God and reason through them and their limitations, the same that we would whenever we look at anthropomorphic language and the nature of God. As Bavinck summarized, God is indeed immutable, but not immobile. In fact, Bavinck will actually look at Augustine's illustration, which is limited or imperfect, and that illustration was of the sun. The sun does not change in its nature, whether it scorches, warms, hurts, or animates. The notion of impassibility is often brought up here as it has a close connection with immutability. Sometimes impassibility is treated as an attribute itself, and at other times it is bound together with immutability. Impassibility in its most basic form generally is explained as God without passions, meaning that God cannot suffer. At this point, there's probably a number of questions about how this all relates to Jesus Christ and the incarnation, and unfortunately, you're going to have to wait until we get to that down the road in this series. From here, we can move into the eternality and the infinity of God. God's infiniteness can be understood as God's perfection. This is using infinity in a qualitative rather than quantitative sense. This is not infinity in the sense of mathematics or magnitude. God is infinitely holy in the sense that he is free from all limitations or defects. Many opt for just calling this God's perfection in order to avoid any confusion with the term infinite, but that's what we are discussing here, that God is free from all limitations and defects. God's infiniteness can be applied to all of God's attributes, such as his wisdom, knowledge, love, etc. He is absolutely perfect. Infinity applied to time speaks to God's eternality, the reality that God is not limited by anything or determined by time. Like it's been mentioned a couple times now, God is the first and the last. He always is, was, and will be. God is eternal. He has no beginning or cause, as we noted above. When infinity is applied to space, it speaks about God's immensity. That is, God transcends all spatial limitations and is present everywhere, usually designated by the term omnipresent. This moves nicely into the most common attributes we hear regarding God's nature, that is omnipotence and omniscience. God's omnipotence refers to God's all-powerful nature, that is the ability to do anything that is consistent with God's own character. Omniscience denotes God's knowledge of all things. From there, two of the most obvious attributes of God are God's spirituality and invisibility. To the former, God is clearly presented as spirit throughout the scriptures, with anthropomorphisms used to describe God's character and works. And God appears in bodily form in what we call theophanies, yet he is understood as not having a body inherently. We can easily understand how spirituality ties in with God's simplicity and invisibility. Paul will describe God as the eternal, immortal, and invisible God in 1 Timothy 1:17. And Christ will state clearly that God is spirit in John 4:24. Discussions have arisen on these realities of God being invisible yet being seen in various manifestations, especially given John's statements in John 1:18 that no one has ever seen the Father. Yet it is helpful to remember that John makes an allusion to Moses in verse 14, where Moses was not allowed to see God in Exodus 33:20. To summarize, there is none that has seen the full glory of God. As Carson will say, apparent exceptions are always qualified in some way. And that's in D.A. Carson's commentary on the Gospel according to John and the Pillar New Testament commentary. But the most well-known attributes of God are those of God's wisdom, trustworthiness, goodness, holiness, righteousness, justice, sovereignty, and so forth. These, along with God's spirituality, are considered communicable. That is, something that we share with God, yet again with limitations in light of God as creator and his perfections and his holiness. God's goodness itself can have much time spent on it, including God's general goodness towards his creatures in providence or care for the world, and his mercy and grace. I will encourage you to go study these attributes in more detail elsewhere, while we will complete our summary here with a discussion on God's holiness. When we think of holiness, we generally think of God's moral perfections, which is appropriate, yet holiness contains more than just God's moral perfections. God is called the Most Holy, and the term means separate. The term describes God's relationship between himself and persons or things. He is distinct from his creatures. He is higher above them in his infiniteness that we have mentioned before, and he has supreme glory. It is God's holiness that is often seen as a particularly permeating attribute of God, in that it designates those realities of God's majesty of power overall. It makes clear the distinction between the Creator and his creation and creatures. The moral aspect likewise stresses God's separation from sin, given his moral perfections. The manifestation of God's holiness often evokes awe and awareness of sin in Isaiah 6. And God's people are called to be distinct or separate from others. They're called to be holy as God is holy. Ultimately, there's so much more that can be said about the attributes of our awesome God. But we're going to stop here, and I'm going to read part of the London Baptist Confession to see how it summarizes the attributes of God. The Lord our God is but one, only living and true God, whose subsistence is in and of himself, infinite and being and perfection, whose essence cannot be comprehended by any but himself, a most pure spirit, invisible, without body, parts, or passions, who only hath immortality, dwelling in the light which no man can approach unto, who is immutable, immense, eternal, incomprehensible, almighty, every way infinite, most holy, most wise, most free, most absolute, working all things according to the counsel of his own immutable and most righteous will, for his own glory, most loving, gracious, merciful, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, the rewarder of all of them that diligently seek him, and withal most just and terrible in his judgments, hating all sin, and who will by no means clear the guilty. God, having all life, glory, goodness, and blessedness in and of himself, is alone in and unto himself all sufficient, not standing in need of any creature which he hath made, nor deriving any glory from them, but only manifesting his own glory in, by, unto, and upon them. He is the alone fountain of all being, of whom, through whom, and to whom are all things, and he hath most sovereign dominion over all creatures, to do by them, for them, and upon them whatsoever himself pleaseth. In his sight, all things are open and manifest. His knowledge is infinite, infallible, and independent upon the creature, so as nothing is to him contingent or uncertain. He is most holy in all of his counsels, in all of his works, in all of his commands. To him is due from angels and men whatsoever worship, service, or obedience as creatures they owe unto the Creator, and whatever he is further pleased to require of them. And that's from chapter 2, section 1 through 2 of the London Baptist Confession of Faith from 1689. Section 3 goes into the Trinity. But you can see here that there's so much there that you can sit and meditate and think on. Our God is awesome. And when we really begin to think over and work out the ramifications of God's attributes in our lives, we can be struck by the magnitude and beauty of our God. Sometimes fear can envelop us like it did with Isaiah when we consider his holiness. But then we also see his goodness in the person and work of Christ and marvel at his love, mercy, and grace. Or perhaps in times of trouble, God's sovereignty and wisdom and faithfulness can ground us and aid us in our walk. Focusing on and thinking through God's attributes is very beneficial, as it is, in fact, part of our goal, to know God and to enjoy him forever. It is highly recommended that the Christian takes some time to read more concerning the attributes of God. But for now, we're going to conclude this episode, and then next time we will discuss creation, providence, and the fall. God bless you all, and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.